If you find yourself in the wrong part of Yellowstone Park, you might be in danger. You see, on the surface, Yellowstone National Park is a paradise. Breathtaking heaven of wildlife and natural beauty which millions of people visit every year to connect with nature. However, hidden deep within this picturesque wilderness lies a dark legal loophole that could allow you to commit a crime as heinous as murder and walk away unpunished. But how is it possible? As some of you might know, Yellowstone was the first national park in the United States, and is also widely held to be the first national park in the world. It's the 8th largest national park in the country, covering over 3,400 square miles and stretching across 3 US states: Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. Most of the park lies in Wyoming. A smaller slice falls into Montana, and an even smaller chunk crosses into Idaho. It's in this tiny 1% portion where the trouble begins. This is the so-called Zone of Death, a peculiar area where geography, legal jurisdiction, and the US Constitution collide in ways that could theoretically allow a criminal to escape justice. To understand how this works and how something so strange could even exist in the 21st century, we first need to take a closer look at the park's legal framework. Perhaps you know that in the United States there are two primary types of laws: state laws and federal laws. State laws apply within the boundaries of individual states and cover everything from traffic rules to criminal codes. Each state has its own legislature, courts, and enforcement systems. Federal laws, on the other hand, apply across the entire country and deal with issues that transcend state lines like immigration, national security, or crimes committed on federal property such as national parks. Typically, state and federal jurisdictions are clearly defined and separate. But in Yellowstone, the overlap of these jurisdictions across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho creates a complicated legal scenario. Yellowstone National Park is unique not just because it was the first national park in the world, but also because Congress had to specifically legislate how it would be governed. When the park was established in 1872, there was no legal framework for managing federal land on this scale. Congress placed Yellowstone under exclusive federal jurisdiction, creating a legal bubble where only federal laws applied and state laws had no authority. This setup made sense at the time, because, as mentioned before, Yellowstone spans 3 states and splitting jurisdictions among them would have been inefficient. While many national parks established later allow for concurrent jurisdiction, where states and federal laws overlap, Yellowstone's exclusive federal jurisdiction remains unique. And for most of the park, this setup isn't an issue. Crimes committed in the Wyoming section are handled by the Federal District Court of the District of Wyoming, which has authority over the entire park. But the Idaho slice of Yellowstone is technically under the same federal court. Now, let's paint a picture. 2 friends, Phil McCracken and Barry McCockiner, decide to camp in Yellowstone for an adventurous weekend. They set up their tent near a lake within the Zone of Death. After a few drinks around the campfire and some heated discussions about life choices, tensions flare into an argument. And then, in a moment of rage, Phil pushes Barry too hard. He falls backward and tragically hits his head on a rock. Panicking, Phil decides to flee, but ultimately turns himself in at the nearest ranger station. And when asked about his actions, he admits everything. But there is a catch. The US Constitution requires that anyone charged with a federal crime must be tried in the state where the crime occurred and in a district that has jurisdiction over the case. Normally, this isn't a problem, because federal judicial districts align neatly with state lines. But Yellowstone is the exception. The Idaho portion of the park is part of the District of Wyoming. So, if a crime is committed in that small Idaho patch, you'd have to find a jury composed of people who both live in Idaho and are part of the District of Wyoming. This is where the loophole appears. Nobody lives in that 50 square mile slice of Idaho. It is completely uninhabited. That means you can't form a jury, and without a jury, you can't have a trial. Without a trial, justice simply stops. What makes this story even more interesting is how the loophole in Yellowstone's legal jurisdiction was discovered. Surprisingly, it wasn't uncovered by some criminal mastermind looking to exploit the system. It came to light through a combination of legal curiosity, and sharp investigative work by Brian Colt, a law professor at Michigan State University. In 2005, Colt published an article titled "The Perfect Crime," which delved into the unusual jurisdictional boundaries of Yellowstone and raised questions about how the park was governed. He pointed out that the loophole posed a significant legal challenge, and as Colt dug deeper into this situation, he realized that it was more than just a weird legal anomaly. It could potentially allow criminals to evade prosecution for serious crimes. However, what made it especially concerning was that this loophole had never been tested in court before. It was a technicality that had gone unnoticed until Colt's work brought it to light. The loophole began to gain traction outside academic circles when, in December of 2005, it was indirectly tested in a real-life case. A poacher named Michael Belderain illegally shot an elk in the Montana section of Yellowstone. While this section of the park does have a small population, sufficient to form a jury, logistical challenges and the unwillingness of locals to serve created complications. Belderain referenced Colt's paper, arguing that his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated because his jury was drawn from the District of Wyoming and not in Montana, where the crime occurred. But U.S. District Court Judge William Downs dismissed the argument, leading to Belderain accepting a plea deal that included a condition preventing him from appealing the zone of death issue. Meanwhile, Colt worked to bring the loophole to Congress's attention, proposing a straightforward solution: reassign the Idaho portion of Yellowstone to the Federal District Court for the District of Idaho. This would resolve the jury issue and close the loophole. However, his efforts were largely ignored. In 2007, another author, Charles Box Jr., attempted to raise awareness by incorporating the zone of death into his novel, Free Fire. The book caught the attention of Wyoming Senator Mike Enzi, but despite his efforts, Congress showed little interest in addressing the issue. At this point, you might wonder, if this issue was identified nearly 2 decades ago, why hasn't it been resolved? Well, the short answer is bureaucracy. To close the loophole, Congress would need to change the federal judicial boundaries, which means either moving the Idaho portion of Yellowstone under the District of Idaho or coming up with a special exception just for the park. That sounds simple enough, but in reality, even small legislative changes like this can be bogged down in politics, competing priorities, or just plain indifference. And considering the zone of death is a pretty niche problem in a remote area, and since no one has actually used it to escape justice, it doesn't exactly scream urgent to lawmakers. Which brings us to the big question: could someone truly get away with murder in the zone of death? Technically, yes. But in practice, it might not be that simple. The federal government isn't going to just shrug its shoulders if someone tries to exploit the zone of death. They could argue in court that the crime should still be prosecuted with a jury, which would likely lead to a legal battle that could go all the way to the Supreme Court. Or, I don't know, they could charge the person with something else, maybe a lesser crime that doesn't require a jury trial, or figuring out a way to move the case to a different jurisdiction. Either way, I don't think the case will immediately cease to exist. However, even though these are just possibilities, the fact that the loophole still exists is enough to ask ourselves, are there other hidden flaws in the system we just haven't found yet? You probably agree with me that such cracks in the system can lead to unbelievable stories. And that's why I'm sure that you'd be curious to know how the FBI catfished 1,000 criminals. Click here to learn about one of the FBI's most cunning operations to date.